When I was in novitiate, a year that those of us who are religious spend in some degree of solitude and silence, learning to pray, learning the ways of the religious community. When I was in novitiate, we also spent one day a week doing some apostolate down in town, which was Colorado Springs, Colorado, in the United States. My apostolate was visiting the sick at Penrose Hospital, Sisters of Charity hospital there. And many fascinating moments of growth happened for me. But I regularly call to mind a woman I met. I don't remember her name. It's now been well over 30 years. But she was a woman who was beginning to slide from some degree of faith into disillusionment, anger, and depression because she was losing the use of her legs. About 15 years earlier, she had had a growth near her spine, and in a somewhat miraculous surgery at the time, it had been removed successfully. As I recall it, it was a growth that was growing around the spine. It had been removed successfully, and she'd lived for 15 years with the ability to walk, something that she knew she could have woken up from that first surgery from without the use of her legs. And for 15 years, she had a fairly blessed life. She thanked God greatly for it, and she knew that it was through God's grace and God's intervention, through his response to her prayers and the prayers of so many people, that she had received the ability to continue walking. And she was now struggling with the idea that scar tissue that had grown where the original surgery had happened was now putting pressure on the spine in the same way the growth had before. And the doctors were telling her there was no chance of removing the scar tissue and that she would lose the use of her legs. She went through, in the weeks that I spent visiting her, she went through a movement from some degree of faith that seemed, at the risk of sounding critical of someone who was suffering, that seemed to be based more on I want it and God will give it to me, than a deep, abiding faith that says God will be with me come what may. And so she waited. She waited in an increasing amount of anger and depression as she lost the use of her legs. Those human emotions are completely understandable. I'm afraid I would venture into them myself. But they are the emotions of someone who has a fairly undeveloped relationship with their Heavenly Father. Christ calls us today to be ready, to be awake, to be prepared. But it is a call not simply to never sleep. It is a call that furthers the beautiful reading we heard from Isaiah, further the thoughts of what Isaiah is telling his people. The people of Israel have returned from Babylon, have returned from exile to find a completely destroyed Jerusalem. Now, for almost 70 years, it has lain fallow. The temple is destroyed. The city is destroyed. And the people of God turn to God in a fairly complex series of thoughts. Why did you let us stray from you? Why did you allow us to harden our hearts against fearing you, against respecting you, against remembering who you were? Oh, that you would tear the heavens open and come down. And no one has seen or heard from any other God what you will do for those who trust you. You were angry when we rebelled. and we know why. But we do know that you are our Father. And though we believe we can somehow separate ourselves from you, you're the potter, we're the clay. How does be on your guard, stay awake, continue those thoughts? It continues those thoughts because the people of Jerusalem, just before they were conquered and sent into exile, had forgotten to be on guard, had forgotten to stay awake, had forgotten that it is a fundamental responsibility to constantly remember what our relationship is with our Heavenly Father, and to constantly seek his guidance, and more importantly, to open our hearts and put our trust in him. Difficulties arise, hardships come, gross human evil happens, but we cannot see that they are of God. They are the results of sin in creation and in our world and in human hearts that have hardened against the fear of God. We are called to recognize always our right relationship with him. And in these long days, as we now experience between Christ's first coming and his second coming, the one that we begin to celebrate this very day, the one whose future we wait for, it is in this interim moment, this moment between the already and the not yet, that we are called to constantly remember and to practice and to be ready for that moment, to make sure that in our lives Christ does not come and find us asleep at the switch. When this woman was unable to see that God could walk with her through whatever might come her way, she had failed, however understandably, to leave a space for God to walk with her, to be with her through the hardships and the difficulties, the suffering and the pain. For Christ knows those too. We live in a country that is anticipating, excited about being able to move out of some of the social restrictions we've known now for the last 6 weeks, a repeat of most of spring and summer. But let us not forget what we've learned, the importance of being cautious, the need to look out for our fellow brothers and sisters, especially the aged and those with compromised health. The friendships that developed, the care that neighbors who didn't know each other before began to take for each other, to look out for the elderly and the homebound. Let us not forget that those are the acts of awaiting people. Those are the acts of people who are staying awake. Those are what people who recognize who they are before their loving God allow their hardened hearts to soften. Those are the acts of people who recognize that we are an Advent people, living out our faith as we wait for the culmination of time. There's a beautiful story that I first heard when I was 13 years old and studying in my first year of high school, a unit on the Holocaust. I don't remember where it came from, but it was a story of an aged rabbi in one of the camps. And it was growing towards the end of the war, and what meager rations they were once given were cut even more, and the bread was really sawdust. And weak soup that was made from nothing much more than water. But every day, this young man saw this aged rabbi take what little he had, what little piece of bread he had, and divide it in half, and give half to someone else. He gave it not just because someone else might need it. The young man found out when he finally asked, "Why do you do that?" And the old rabbi said, "They can take our freedom, and they can take our liberty, but they cannot take our humanity. We fully live our humanity. We live our godliness. No one can take it from us, but we can give it away. Let us strive always to have softened hearts. Let us strive always to support those who are suffering, especially those who are in some degree of despair, especially those who are losing hope. But let us witness with every act of our lives to the fullness of the truth that we celebrate today."